All right, so we are recording this for anybody who is wanting to watch after the fact. We did just get started, and I gave a prompt to the group to take about 30 seconds just to reflect on and write some ideas down. When you're thinking about effective behavior support systems and tier 2 and tier 3 supports or multi-tiered system of support for behavior, what are some of our goals? And just about 10 more seconds. Good, thank you. I love the responses that are coming into the chat box. Please use that richly throughout our session today. All of the things that you all are saying are things that I wholeheartedly agree with in terms of the climate that we're trying to create, in terms of making sure that we're providing access to instruction for all of our students, hopefully in least restrictive environments, providing tools, supports, and structure. So great responses. What I put down for this is really quite general, but if we think about what is the ultimate experience that we're hoping to create for all of our students, our goals for our behavior support system, this is what I put down, is that we're trying to develop through the supports and the structures that we put in place, schools full of students who match the following description. They're respectful, they're responsible, they're motivated, and they're highly engaged in hopefully the meaningful tasks that our teachers are providing. So one of the concepts that I really want to emphasize here is that behavior support is not just about the absence of misbehavior. I think a lot of times our support systems really focus on that idea of eliminating non-compliant behavior and trying to get kids to reduce disruptive behavior and make sure that they're on task. And of course, all of those things are important. But we also want to think about, how do we reduce apathy? How do we prevent, those students who are coming to school and they're kind of just putting in their time or doing the bare minimum to like skate through and slide under the radar, but they're not really excited to be with us. They're maybe not super excited about what they're learning or what they're doing. We want to make sure that we are continually designing and refining our system to think about not just helping our students survive our school system, but how to thrive within it, so that hopefully when they become parents or when they are off out in the world and somebody asks them about their school experience, they've got really great things to say about it. So this is like, it's very aspirational, I think, when we think about this idea of refining our system. Now, for what we are doing for today's quick little 1-hour webinar, we've got some pretty heavy objectives to try and cover in our hour together. So this is going to be pretty fast and furious. We are going to be focusing on the idea of ways to either create, if you're kind of starting at square one, which some schools are really now trying to take, we've done a lot with MTSS for academics. Now, how do we apply that to behavior? I also know that many of you are operating within systems where you, for decades, have been working on strengthening your MTSS for behavior approaches. So either creating or strengthening systematic evidence-based processes. We really want to focus on what are those proven practices that we can put in place in our school systems to support students with varied behavioral needs. And a big part of this is taking some of those things that a lot of our schools do informally. A lot of schools know how important it is to assign students like meaningful jobs or meaningful tasks. But is that a formal intervention that you have within our school system? A lot of schools have check-in, check-out types of interventions for behavior. But do people know how to systematically identify a concerning behavior and put it into objective and measurable terms, turn it into specific targets, and work to analyze those targets across time? Right? So again, it's taking these things that may already be somewhat in our system and really trying to refine them so that they are evidence-based, they are systematic, and that they're not personnel dependent, right? How many of us have worked in school systems where there's something really great happening and then one person moves and the whole thing kind of falls apart? So how do we get away from personnel specific? I'm looking at you, Jodie Foster, like as you are moving away from your building, right? Are the systems strong enough in place that we can retain those systems and the effectiveness of that approach despite one or two key people moving to a different position? So we're going to focus on 3 critical concepts. The first one is, do we have multiple methods for identifying the students who may require additional support beyond what we're doing at the school-wide, class-wide, tier 1 level? Okay, so that's the first big bucket of what we're going to look at. The next is looking at ways of creating additional problem-solving layers to ensure that students and the staff who work with those students don't end up on waiting lists for support. And what I mean by that is a lot of schools will have a wonderful intervention team that meets, if they have the luxury, once a week. Sometimes it's bi-weekly, sometimes it's once a month. But let's imagine we have a team that meets bi-weekly and they meet on the first Monday of the month, but a kid gets referred right after the last meeting. It could end up being a couple of weeks before anybody even starts talking about that student. The longer our students have to sit on waiting lists and the longer that staff have to wait, if they are feeling a sense of frustration or concern, it starts dooming a lot of our interventions to failure. So we're going to talk about ways that we can start creating some layers in between those team-based problem-solving approaches. And then the third big topic that we're going to talk about is building a menu of behavior interventions across time and identifying additional interventions that you can start building into your system across time to meet varied student needs. So 1 hour, we've got a lot to cover. Let's dive right in. Just a couple of logistics. Again, we're aiming to finish direct content within about an hour, but I'm happy to stay on for questions at the end if anyone has them. Please use the chat box richly throughout our time together to engage with each other. I will try to monitor that periodically, but I have trouble talking and reading at the same time, so I may miss some things. Please participate. I've got a couple of polls that I'm going to put up there, so just be prepared to put a quick response in there. We have the handout for you to take notes on or for you to have after the fact. Anything that I have in my slides that is not in the handout, if you look in the right-hand corner of my slides, you'll see a little blue box that says not in handout. So feel free for any of those things to take a screenshot, take a picture with your camera. I, per company policy, am not supposed to give out my full slide deck, but you are welcome to take those notes however you would like to. And if there's a specific slide or two that you'd like me to send you, I'm happy to do that. So just feel free to email me. All right, session is being recorded, so this will be uploaded after the fact for folks to be able to watch after today's session. If this is useful to you and you have a team or any other individuals that you want to watch with you so that you can do some group problem solving, please feel free to do so. We'll send you all the link for that. All right, lastly, questions, please feel free to type those in the chat box or just write them down for yourself. Again, I may miss them if they are coming in the chat box while I'm talking. So just hold on to them until the end and we'll try and address them at that time, or you can send me an email and I'm happy to do some back and forth with you individually. All right, so getting started. I am sure that for most of you, the multi-tiered system of support triangle is nothing new that you are seeing. You've seen this in PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports. You've seen it with RTI, response to intervention. The important thing to recognize is that this triangle represents the holistic system. We sometimes are looking at it with a particular lens. So if we're talking academics and we're talking, prevention of special education referrals and things like that, identification of specific learning disability, we might call it RTI, response to intervention. If we are looking at it from a behavioral lens, we might be calling it PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports, or multi-tiered system of support, MTSS-B, for MTSS for behavior. But it's really important to recognize it's one system, right? And especially when we start moving to tier 2, tier 3, and thinking about the kids that need something additional, we have to be very, very cautious to put kids into silos of like, we are the behavior tier 2, tier 3 team. We are the attendance tier 2, tier 3 problem solving team. We are the academic, because of the issue of comorbidity, right? When we have a student who has a behavioral concern, every once in a while, it's just a behavioral concern. That's usually when they're younger in our school system, and we can work just to address the behavior and everything else kind of stabilizes. But more often than not, if we have a kid who has behavioral struggles, they may also have academic struggles, right? Or they may also have behavioral or attendance struggles. And it's really a chicken or egg type of question, like which one came first, but they all feed each other. So the student has a behavioral struggle, they start falling behind academically because they're getting sent out of class, or they're, there are a lot of disruptions, so they're not learning as much. But then what starts to happen is, because the kid is academically behind, they start feeling frustrated and disengaged. So behavioral problems start to spiral more, then they get sent out more, right? Round and round we go. Same thing happens with attendance. Kid has a attendance or a behavioral concern, one starts to feed the other, and then we start to have these related problems. So when we're talking tier 2 and tier 3, I'm really going to encourage you not just to think about it as, your behavioral tier 2, tier 3. Yes, we can have that lens, but as soon as we identify a student who has a behavioral need that is not being met at tier 1, we have to start asking ourselves, how is the student doing academically and how are they doing with attendance? Because if either of those things are a part of the picture, it has to be part of the intervention plan. Okay. Now, just conceptually, one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to do when we think about the efficiency of our system is conceptually to turn your triangle upside down. And what you're thinking about with this is it's the idea that your system is like a filter. Can we catch 80 to 90% of our students with effective tier 1 supports? So nothing more than what we're doing at the district, school-wide, class-wide level, universal systems for all. Then we're always going to have some students who need a little bit more. So even if our system is functioning really, really well, we'll have some students who slide to that next layer. How can we catch an additional 10 to 15% of our students with what we would call targeted tier 2 interventions? So a little bit more specific to what does that kid need? If it's a kid who needs more attention and more connection, we're going to design interventions that meet that need. If it's a kid where, their behavior is related to an academic concern, then a big part of that tier 2 intervention is going to be looking at intervention for the academic need. If it's escape avoidance, we'll be trying to address that particular need. So slightly more intensive, we're going to have a layer that we try to catch more students at that level. If our system is functioning well, hopefully we have only about 2 to 5% of our kids that are needing the more intensive wraparound, oftentimes very complex types of intervention plans that require a lot of resources at the tier 3 level. So just to give you an example of this, when we're looking at the behavioral lens, if we're thinking about our universal tier 1, do we have 80 to 90% of our students that are matching the goal that we identified at the beginning of the session? Students who are respectful, responsible, motivated, and highly engaged. Are 80 to 90% of our students matching that goal with nothing more than what we're doing at the district, school-wide, class-wide level? So are our common areas so well structured and so well supported, and adults are on the same page? We've got adults who know how to actively supervise in positive and proactive ways. We've got adults who know how to correct mildly and fluently so that we help everybody kind of course correct in our common areas. In our classrooms, do our classroom teachers have enough of a skill set with behavioral problem solving and classroom management that 80 to 90% of the students in their class are highly motivated, highly engaged, highly respectful, and highly responsible with nothing more than what the classroom teacher is doing? Because what we never want to have is a teacher who's trying to manage 8, 10, or 15 individual behavior support plans within a classroom environment. It's not possible, right? So how do we help them stabilize that base? What do we do to strengthen the tier 1? Conceptually, many of you have probably heard something like this before. Oftentimes, the best tier 2, tier 3 is really strengthening your tier 1, right? So when we start to see that we're overwhelming our tier 2, tier 3 systems, our counselors, our social workers, our school psychologists, anyone who's in that sort of interventionist headset, and we're like, we do not have enough of those staff members, the implication has always got to be, how do we go back and strengthen our tier 1 universal school-wide or classroom approach so that we have fewer students who are needing intervention? And so again, anytime we've got 20% or even 15% or more of our students who are looking like they require individualized intervention, part of our work is thinking about that tier 1 approach. Now, with that said, this is a tier 2, tier 3 session. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take a minute, and you have this in your handout, but I'm also going to put it up as a poll, to think about, at this point in the school year, if you were to say, what are the biggest cracks in our tier 2, tier 3 intervention approaches? What are the things that give you the biggest heart palpitations that you're like, we really need to get a handle on this prior to next school year so that hopefully we're not running around the building putting out fires all the time? That's a very common term that I hear people say, or so that hopefully we're not having long waiting lists of kids where like we do not have enough personnel to be able to intervene with the number of students that we have. So I'm going to put up a poll. And this is a multiple choice. You can select as many of the boxes as you would like. And I'm just going to kind of talk you through these as you're filling that out. So some common pitfalls that we see in intervention systems is we've got situations that are being referred to like a tier 2, tier 3 interventionist or intervention team that really could have or should have been solved with effective tier 1 approaches. So for example, I hope that we never have a student who's getting referred for an FBA or intensive intervention. And like the recommendation that comes back from the board certified behavior analyst is everybody needs to give that kid a little bit more positive attention. And we think that would resolve the problem, right? Like that is such a common high leverage strategy that hopefully we're continually working to help our teachers and other staff members implement, that it would never get to that level of intervention if that's the only thing that needs to be part of the intervention plan. Could be we have too few interventionists and too many referrals. I know many of you are in situations of deep concerns about budget cuts, and some of those personnel that are critical, our counselors, our social workers, our deans, our coaches, are the folks who are getting cut. And so now we have to be thinking about how do we do the same amount or sometimes more with less. We've got too few people to currently meet the need of the intervention that we have. Sometimes it's significant gaps between tiers. So I hear some people say like, we've only really got like one thing at tier 2, we've got check in, check out, but then we don't have a heck of a lot more. So everything kind of goes from like tier 1, then we have to kind of jump over to tier 3. Sometimes people will be like, we really don't have any tier 2, tier 3. It's like general education and special education. And so then everything gets lumped into, if there's a behavioral need, we have to start looking at a special ed referral, which is not in any way, shape, or form appropriate because special ed is a continuum of services. It's not a tier, right? So thinking about those gaps that you might have between tiers, sometimes there's a big gaping chasm between tier 1 and tier 2. A lack of a systematic process for identifying and implementing interventions. So yes, we identify that we've got kids who have got needs, but we kind of make it up when it comes to us. We don't have a lot of specific procedures, protocols, et cetera, once we do identify a student for how we're going to intervene. Lack of flexibility in the process, which oftentimes kind of looks like we've got these like rigid check boxes, do this first step, do this second step, but maybe people are just kind of like checking those off without really good faith effort to implement and see if the student responds. So it's kind of like those hoops we jump to try to get the student to oftentimes another placement or another level of service. And then the last one, lack of follow through on interventions and next steps. So we design these great interventions, but we either don't implement them with fidelity or we do, but then we don't ever really consider when we need to intensify or fade on a systematic basis. All right. Giving you some time to fill those out. Let's take another 10 seconds or so, and then I'll share that poll with you. All right, we're up to about 2/3 of folks who have responded. So let's go ahead and end that there. So sharing these results, we've got kind of a wide range of different things. And again, these are just very common comments when we're doing this work that we hear from folks. What I really want you to think about is between now and the start of the school year, and based on some of the ideas that I share, and I'll also be sharing some resources, which of these are highest priority for you within your school to try and get resolved as much as you can between now and the start of the school year? Some of them are going to be ones that are really over time, right? We have too few interventionists and, sorry, it should say too many referrals. That's going to be sort of an ongoing moving target because it's how do we look at building the skill of lots of different folks within our buildings? How do we build layers of problem-solving processes where we might start with one layer this year? So I'm going to be giving you a vision of like what you might be thinking about in the next 3 to 5 years. And what I really want you to be thinking about is based on your responses here, what is going to be your most logical starting place to really focus in and put some time, effort, and energy on refining one part of your system for the start of next school year. Okay. All right. So let's talk about identification. With identification for tier 2 and tier 3, this is that really important piece of this has to be systematic. because I work with far too many schools and far too many districts. Kim, I'm sure you've encountered this as well. Kim Earthman is one of my wonderful colleagues who's here with us, that sometimes we don't have a really systematic process for identifying those kids with additional needs. And it basically takes somebody hitting the last straw, right? So that teacher is like, I am done with this kid, and starts to reach out for support. Or it takes a sort of crisis level event. We have a major behavioral set of escalation incidents, or we have a student who has some really significant mental health needs that then start to emerge and rise to the top of what we need to address. And what we want to make sure of is that we have identification methods that help us intervene earlier, help us identify those students who may have needs earlier, both within the course of a school year. So I never want to wait until a student has racked up 4, 5, 6 behavioral referrals before we start getting support for that kid and that teacher. I never want to wait until, the student has missed 30 days of school before we start thinking about how do we support and intervene, right? Can we start intervening within the first month of school if we have some metrics that will help us identify students earlier? It's also very, very important that we're identifying students as early as possible within their school career, because many of our students who we start to identify later in elementary school or middle or high school, we actually could have started predicting that they were going to have needs that needed to be intervened with as early as pre-K or K if we had some more evidence-based processes for identifying these are kids who need support. So I'm going to share with you some of the ways that we can do that. Conceptually, another very, very important thing to recognize is that there's 2 big categories of behavioral concern. Kids can sit within both of them, so sometimes they cross between these 2. But in terms of how we identify them, we have some students who exhibit what's called externalizing behavior. That's the outwardly directed. The kid oftentimes has what we would call behavioral excesses. So they make a lot of noise, lots of disruption, maybe lots of non-compliance. And again, when they're feeling frustrated, overstimulated, anxious about something, that behavior goes outside of themselves, right? These are the kids who make it very clear that they have needs, oftentimes pretty early on. And a lot of our school systems have actually done a pretty good job in many locations at building layers of support for our students who have externalizing challenges because they make their needs known, right? I have an equal, if not greater level of concern about our students who have internalizing behavior. So the kids that behavior, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling upset about something, I'm feeling overstimulated, and they withdraw, they shut down, they get quiet, they pull away from people. So these might be our students who are experiencing anxiety, depression, sometimes manifests in other different ways. But again, oftentimes the kids who kind of go inward instead of outward. What we know from the research literature is that a lot of times our school systems are not really designed to help us identify these students. And in many school systems, we do not have nearly enough built into the system to address our students with internalizing challenges. Now, if there is one thing that I will say about COVID, it's that I think we've got a greater awareness that we have more students now than ever before that have internalizing concerns, that have anxiety, that are feeling disconnected. And so there's more awareness there, but now we need our system to catch up with what do we do about it. So this is a real good question that I've been asking a lot of folks, kind of related to what we talked about at the beginning, is previously, were you addressing like students who have anxiety and it's manifesting in them having struggles in school? Were you addressing that primarily as like a tier 3 set of interventions? What do you have at tier 2? And in a lot of schools, we have so many kids that are presenting with needing intervention plans related to anxiety. Is there more that could be done at the school-wide, class-wide level? Right? So are our classrooms calm enough that students who are experiencing anxiety are feeling calm? Do they have a good sense of routine and predictability, which is important for students with anxiety, students who have experienced trauma, lots of students who have behavioral concerns? When they go out into the hallways, are those hallways calm and predictable and adults aren't constantly yelling at kids, right? So there's like structural elements that we can consider. There's also things like teaching approaches. So if we saw that we had a lot of students who are struggling with coping with anxious thoughts and feelings, are we teaching lessons on coping strategies within our classrooms? Are we doing little activities that help us sort of check in on how students are doing in ways that are non-stigmatizing so that adults can then connect with those kids when they are seeing that they need some additional support? So externalizing and internalizing needs. Now, in terms of the formal procedures that we can put in place for identification, there's 3 things that we can consider doing. If you can do all 3, that's great. But again, this is where maybe your vision for 3 to 5 years from now is we're using all 3. But your first step is we're going to build 1 or 2 of these. Okay, so we have universal screening, we have red flags, and we have formal or informal requests for support. For universal screening, these are whole school measures. They're usually, there are some that are free online, but a lot of them are like a paid subscription you would use for your school, that are evidence-validated procedures to predict which students might be at risk for long-term behavior problems and poor outcomes. It's important to know that these are screening measures. So, you will screen some students and you get a false positive. It's like we look at it, we follow the student for a little while and we realize they're doing okay, at least for now, despite these risk factors. But for a lot of your students, it's kind of like if you go to your doctor and immediately they see, oh my gosh, you've got a major blood pressure spike and there's something else going on. We need to look more deeply at what might be happening. So screening measures, they're not diagnostic. They don't tell us what's happening, but they tell us that something is rising up to a level of concern that we need to look more closely for this student. Most of these measures are conducted 1 to 3 times a year. SSBD, which is systematic screening for behavior disorders. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I believe that they recommend you do your first screening within week like 6 to 8 of school. So we've had enough time to get to know the students, but now we can have our teachers do a real quick behavioral screening. And by week 6 of school, we have a list of students that we need to look into and maybe start intervening with some of them. Just to give you some examples of some different screeners that are out there, I'm not going to take time to really dive into these. You can look at them on your own or feel free to ask me some follow-up questions later. SSBD, systematic screening for behavior disorders, full disclosure, our company does publish that, but it's a partnership with Phil Walker and Herb Severson out of University of Oregon. SSBD is oftentimes referred to in the research literature as the gold standard of universal screening. And a lot of the other screeners that are out there actually validate that their measures work because they get the same results as SSBD when they compare them. SSBD is basically within an hour, if you can get your entire teaching staff to do a 1-hour screening of their class, or like you select a class period that each teacher is going to do, you come out of that hour with a list of your students that may need a closer look. So SSBD is one to consider. I know a lot of schools use the BASC, the Behavioral and Emotional Screening System. They're on their 3rd edition. Student Risk Screening Scale, SSRS, which is for grades K through 6. And I was recently working with several districts who were using the DESA, the Devereux Student Strength Assessment. I know that there are others out there. So if you have used some and if you know that they are evidence-based, please feel free to put those in the chat box. And again, feel free to get in touch with me if you've got questions, especially about SSBD. I'm not as well-versed in some of the others. So universal screening helps us, before we have to wait for that pattern of office disciplinary referrals or some other major type of thing, within week 6 or so of school, we can start to identify a list of kids. Along with that, we're always going to recommend that you have some sets of red flag indicators that every 6 to 8 weeks, you're pulling data sets. These are usually existing data sets you have within your building. So it's just a matter of saying to whoever your data coordinator is, or assigning this as a task to somebody who has access within the system, please pull these 3 to 5 reports, or these 5 to 7 reports. We're going to monitor this. We're going to mark in our calendar every 6 to 8 weeks when we're going to pull that data, and we're going to see what names pop up, especially for those students that have not already been identified as needing intervention. And part of that is to help so that, if we did a universal screening at the beginning of the school year, but we have a student who had a major life crisis event that happened, or something is changing in the kid's life, and it is now January, we don't screen again until the spring, that again, we're able to start using some metrics to help us sort of, who are our kids that are popping up on our radar that we need to pay attention to. Some examples of some possible red flags. Academic failure. For those of you who work in high school settings, one of the main red flags that we're going to strongly recommend that you use is about 4 weeks into each term or semester, whenever you have your grading period. By week 4 or so of that time period, that you are identifying any of your 9th grade students who have D's or F's and currently are possibly looking like they might be on the road to course failure. The reason for that is because the research on student dropout is so strong that as soon as a student in 9th grade fails one class where now they're looking at credit recovery, their likelihood of graduating goes significantly down. So let's make sure that we have a flag that when we're now dealing with a student who is facing credit recovery types of issues, we intervene before the last 2 days of the term, right? Let's have all of our teachers just refer, here are our kids, that if we do not intervene now, they're probably not going to make it through this course. Chronic absence, students who are missing 10% or more of the school year. This is one that is very powerful because it can help identify both students who are externalizing, but it's oftentimes a big warning indicator for students who have internalizing needs. So the kids that are feeling anxious about something, the kids who are dealing with something outside of school or inside that they're not quite sure how to handle, so they stay home from school. It also is such a warning indicator when a student is missing 10% or more that they could develop academic or behavioral concerns at a later time period that we want to intervene very quickly. So I'm always going to recommend that schools mark day 20 of their calendar and pull who are our kids who missed 2 or more days in the first 20 days of school, and that then we're monitoring that regularly across the course of the school year so that we're seeing who are our kids who start developing patterns of absence across time. Now, with that said, again, these flags are like, you've got to use good professional judgment. My daughter this year, who loves school, who does well academically, she got pneumonia at the beginning of the school year and she missed 5 days. Then her immune system was shot. So then she got strep partway through the school year. Then she got COVID. Each time she was missing a number of days of school. That would be a situation where her name might flag. And the school is like, we know that this student doesn't need intensive intervention at this time, but we are just going to make sure she knows we really missed her when she was gone. Right? Sometimes your flags are simply going to tell you, like, just connect a little bit more with that student. But sometimes kid is missing, 4 days in the first 20 days of school. And we're like, we know this family, we know the kid's circumstances, and we know we need to start intervening right away. So you've got some other examples here: exclusionary discipline, multiple office disciplinary referrals, multiple detentions. You can set your threshold for what you would say, like, when are we seeing a pattern that would indicate intervention is needed? The next two, frequent mindfulness or reset or timeout teacher partner visits, basically kid is being sent out of class or kid is asking to go out of class for a period of time, oftentimes to kind of calm down, to, get a little bit less stimulation happening. Also frequent nurse and counselor office visits. I love that we are in an era where there is much more sensitivity to, we need to honor students are people. And sometimes our kids get overstimulated and they need to be able to calm down. But I do worry that in some school systems, we've let that go a little bit off the rails and we're not tracking it, right? So the student could potentially be leaving classes all the time to go see the nurse, go see the counselor, to go take a little reset or calm down time. And now we've got an additional problem. Student is becoming more disengaged, they're falling behind academically. So again, you need to set a threshold with your staff for what pattern indicates a pattern that's a concern that we need to look more carefully at. But I do strongly recommend that if you have any of these procedures in your buildings, make sure that you build centralized tracking of who is going, how often, and how much, so that you can make sure that you are identifying patterns. When do we need to start to intervene? Lots of other possibilities for possible red flags. Definitely, if we know that a student is experiencing a major life event, family is going through divorce, we've got a family member who's got a major illness or close friend, death in the family, etc. So you can consider if there are additional flags that you would want to build into your system. All right, so we have screening, we have red flags. Both of those are going to help us identify nets of students that we may need to look more carefully at. We also want to make sure that we have some procedures within our buildings that are carefully advertised and monitored that are requests for assistance. We work with some schools where they have a dedicated email address that is just checked like every single day, or if it's a small school, they're all going to go to this administrator or this dean or this counselor, who will make sure that if a request for support comes in from a teacher or a staff member, that by 24 hours from the receipt of that, we have some adult who is connecting with that person and finding out what's the concern and what do you need. Right? So that again, we don't wait for a week, 2 weeks, or a month before we start initiating support for that teacher or that other staff member. Equally important, I know that a lot of schools do have, like, they let their families know, if you have a concern, please reach out. But we do find that sometimes families and students are more likely to use those procedures if you have both a print and an electronic form, and that they can submit it to an email address, that you have like a couple of boxes within your buildings where if people write it, they could then just slip it in a slot, but that we advertise to our students and our families, if you are struggling with anything within our school, we want you to make sure that you know that there are avenues for support, and here's how you can access that. So again, these are things that a lot of times we have very informally within our system. It's just making sure that we put a little bit more effort to make them a systematic part of what we're going to put in place. All right, so that's our identification methods. Now let's talk a little bit about problem solving. And with problem solving, what I'm talking about is when a student is having a concern, that we have some people, now we're moving beyond just teacher is doing what they do, but we've got a kid who's got a concern, and now we need to have some collaborative problem solving. So in many schools in many districts, the model looks like this. Teacher does what they do. And then when there's an ongoing concern, there's some way that they then try to access some sort of support team. That's oftentimes called like a child study, problem solving, or student support team. Different schools have different things they call them. I sometimes hear them called care teams. I was recently in a district where they called them their 20% teams. So like, you know, the 20% of kids that are not responding to, but whatever you call it, some group of interventionists, oftentimes administrators, are also involved that meet to talk about individual students. Now, as I mentioned before, in some schools and districts, we don't even have that level of support. And so then it basically is teacher does what they do. And when the student is not responding, our only other option now is something like a special ed referral. The first model here can work, but it's fragile. My guess is if it is working in your system, you have really effective teachers, really effective common area structures, not a lot of students who are getting triggered by things in the environment, and maybe not a lot of students who have individualized support needs. You also probably have a rock star student support team. So you've got that like fantastic counselor, administrator, school psychologist, and social worker who work really well together and all understand behavioral intervention. But if any part of that shifts, this model starts to fall apart, right? If you have this model, this is not effective. So you want to start moving towards at least getting a student support team starting to be initiated and getting some expertise there. But what oftentimes happens with either of these models is what I've described already, waiting lists for intervention, right? And let's just take a second, go ahead and type into the chat box, what is the concern when we have a student who is struggling behaviorally? And let's use an externalizing example. So we've got a student who is talking back to teachers, is verbally and physically maybe kind of mild escalation, but is escalating, is causing a lot of disruption in the class. And teacher or teachers refer this student to the student support team, but now they have to wait for a month before that team even meets. So what is the concern with that? Go ahead and type into the chat box, what concerns do you have with that model? The behaviors increase in the weight. Thank you, Jody. Absolutely. And some of that is because our adults may lose some of their patience with the behavior, right? What else is a concern? Academic time is lost. Absolutely. So in that month of time, we are losing valuable instructional time, both within the class, but probably also as that student is increasingly getting excluded from the class, increased loss of academic instruction for that student, which potentially makes the behavior problem worse. no support and frustration. The adults give up. Oftentimes, by the time we even start to talk to the adults at that point, they're kind of like wiping their hands of the situation. They're just like, take the kid out and fix them, right? Like, I've done everything that I can do. Sherry mentioned behaviors can become habits and they become harder to address. So the longer we let those behavioral habits get ingrained, the harder it becomes to change them. So here's what we're gonna give you as possible food for thought is 2 interim layers. We also have an additional layer. I just don't have time to address it, but as we start moving past student support, we can talk about a multidisciplinary team. But at the earlier stages of tier 2, teacher common area supervisors starting to have a struggle. They're like, I don't know what to do next, or I need some support. One of the layers of options that we can build in is teacher to teacher problem solving or staff to staff problem solving. And what that can look like is, yes, maybe I do make a referral to the student support team, but in the interim time period, I know they're not going to even talk about it for another month. In that interim time period, while I'm waiting, I have some avenues to request assistance from collaborative problem solving partners. So what we might do is, you all in your buildings probably know who are your behavior management experts, your teachers, your paraprofessionals, your interventionists who really have a headset and a skill set for how to work with our toughest kids. So you might start to sort of solicit, would those people be willing to be part of a collaborative problem solving list where we could advertise out, if you are having a concern with XYZ, here are people that are open to collaborative problem solving. Part of what you're trying to do, I'm always thinking about those new teachers who kind of don't know what they don't know, and sometimes they don't know who to go to. Right? And so they go to the person that's right next door, and maybe that person is the person who is burned out, is super frustrated with behavior, is basically going to tell them, you know, our administrator just doesn't support us and this kid is broken. And so you just need to keep referring the student over and over and over again, and is not going to be giving them the best of advice about how they might actually address the concern in their environment. What we want to do is create a network of some of those people who really are our most inspirational, are, you know, have that mindset of like persistence, resilience, and hope that they can be giving some of our newer teachers, or our teachers who are now working with students that have a different level of behavioral need than they've ever had before. And so we're starting to build that collaborative problem solving within our building. Sometimes what schools will do with this is they'll actually build this in as a structured support as part of their PLCs, professional learning communities. So I work with a lot of schools where they have academic PLCs and groups of teachers get together to talk about academic needs and individual students. But it's less common that I see that people are taking some of that time to say, let's do behavioral problem solving. Let's get grade level teachers together, and one person is going to bring a case study student, or I am struggling with XYZ, and they're bringing it to their collaborative problem solving team of like 4 heads are better than 1, right? Now, I know sometimes the hesitation with that is like, what could possibly go wrong? If we throw 4 or 5 teachers together to talk about a kid, sometimes we can predict where this might go wrong. We have 30 minutes, and we're going to spend 30 minutes talking about all the problems and not identifying any solutions. We're going to spend 30 minutes blaming the parents or blaming our administrator. What could possibly go wrong, right? So what you're going to need if you do this is some sort of protocol that helps you really make sure, and you would train and support all of your teachers or staff members in how to use something like this. I'm not going to give you a copy of this. This 25-minute planning process lives currently within our foundations material, which is our school-wide PBIS type of approach in Module F. But the reason that I'm showing it to you is one of my immediate tasks that I'm working on is trying to turn this into a little standalone product that would be very inexpensive, but it's basically like how do you use this 25-minute protocol with teams of teachers or other small group teams within your school. And I know this is small within your screen, but it starts out with a few minutes for background information. The person who is bringing the student's case forward shares some information about what they're seeing. spend a couple of minutes sort of honing in on what is the goal and the target and what data might be collected. If you can see it on step 3, you'll notice that there are only 2 minutes allocated within the 25 for corrective consequences. So that's one of the pitfalls that we wanted to correct for, is that you have 25 minutes and you spend 22 of them talking about punishment, because we know that that's the weakest variable. Let's spend just 2 minutes talking about that. But then we start moving into the delineation of responsible versus irresponsible behavior, brainstorming for 5 to 7 minutes, possible proactive strategies, so positive attention that could be given, structural supports that could be put in place, strategies you could use to teach the student the expectation, and so on. So this is just a very structured protocol that we have found helps guide teams of teachers to have that be an early stage problem-solving process. Another thing that you can consider, so going from, we had sort of this model here, right? Teachers doing what they do, and then they're referring to some sort of team. Another interim step that you could consider is building in a layer of what we call support coordinators. And the support coordinator layer is basically saying 2 heads are better than 1. So yes, you can refer to the student support team that is 4 people, 7 people, 8 people, but we're also going to have this interim layer of folks that are identified interventionists that we have trained and supported in how to do behavioral intervention. They are available to you. So your identified interventionists, your support coordinators, are people like your counselors, social workers, school psychs, instructional behavioral coaches, maybe some of those teacher leaders that we could really build up into being this sort of part of this support network for tier 2 intervention. Oftentimes administrators or deans would also be included, and maybe even like your nurse or your school resource officer, if they would be logical people, especially if they really connect with kids. So what these folks do is, if the teacher is struggling, we train these people in basic behavioral consultation and how to consult with a teacher who is needing some problem-solving support. They also are very well versed in the menu of interventions that I'm going to share with you in a moment, and can link the student into that. So if like this teacher is meeting with the, let's say, social worker who is their support coordinator. And the support coordinator is like, you know, it's sounding like this student would really benefit from a meaningful job within the school that would get them some skill building, that would get them connection with another adult. And, you know, I know that you've got some great things happening in your classroom, but let's see if we can access a meaningful job, because that's one of the interventions that we already have up and running in our building. Now it's that counselor's job to get the teacher and the student access into that intervention. So they're almost serving in like a case manager sort of format, but really giving that I am advocating for the student within the system to make sure that they are getting the intervention that they need. All right. Now, this gets me to a really important question, which is, do our folks who are doing interventions, so if you are thinking about building support coordinators, or if you do have a student support team, how well versed are those folks in evidence-based behavioral intervention? And sometimes what I find is people have really deep knowledge and expertise, or we at least have a few people on the team, especially if you've got like a school psych, sometimes a special ed teacher who's got some real deep knowledge in behavior. They understand the evidence base. But a lot of times we've got adults who have never been even exposed to what do we do when we intervene. And it's sort of like throwing spaghetti at the wall. Like, let's just hope that something sticks. And so we're kind of making it up as we go. So for example, within your handout, I think this is on page 4, I put in from one of our resources interventions, 5 critical considerations for any tier 2 or tier 3 behavioral intervention. We have to make sure that adults know how to define the problem and the goal for the intervention using, and this is the important part, objective and measurable terms. And what I mean by that is sometimes I see a behavior intervention plan where it has a description like behave better or be more motivated. And I'm like, how does the student know what to do if that's our goal, is to behave better? Because there's a lot of interpretations of that, right? So does behave better mean sit in your seat during assigned seat times, raise your hand instead of blurting out, right? Like, what is the actual target that would say, here was the concern, and here's when we know the concern has gotten better? So this is a skill set, right? This is something that not everybody knows how to do, is how to move from subjective, very interpretive types of terms, which oftentimes really don't give us what we need to be able to design an effective intervention, to those very targeted, objective, measurable terms. My special ed folks are like, you're speaking language, right? Because this then leads to data collection. A next step is, do we have adults who understand how to analyze the problem and get at least preliminary information that it would help us understand, is what we're seeing a skill deficit or a performance deficit? So like a can't do versus a won't do problem. So if it is, a student who is escalating like in the anger cycle, is it a student who actually has the skill to de-escalate, or is it a student where we need to teach them that skill and have them practice it? Right? So can't do versus won't do. Are these adults who have at least some basic knowledge of understanding antecedents and setting events, the triggers that set up a behavior to happen, and the possible function or outcome that causes it to continue? Because as all of us know who are from the behavioral world, that's a very powerful toolkit, function-based problem solving, that can help us design more effective interventions. Third thing, possible solutions and selecting intervention strategies, that we have folks who understand we can't just pick the bigger, better punishment. We have to be looking at a range of antecedent, teaching, and positive and corrective consequence strategies, but that a big part of any intervention plan has to be, how are we increasing positive interactions and improving student connectedness? Really making sure that we're hinging on that sort of strengths-based approach with our student. Fourth step, do we have adults who understand procedures for collecting data and monitoring progress? If we are just taking anecdotal notes when we get to tier 2 and tier 3, it's way too subjective, right? Once we start getting to tier 2 and tier 3 behavior intervention, we have to have something we can chart or track so that we can monitor progress across time. And then the last step, do we have a plan for monitoring fidelity? And we know how to do that. And really making concrete decisions about the student's response to whatever intervention that we tried, either to maintain, to increase the intensity of the intervention or try something new, or to hopefully fade the student off of it if they no longer need it. So here's my question to all of you. You don't have to write this in the chat box, but just kind of consider within your system, how many of your staff that are in the role of interventionist in some way, shape, or form know and understand how to do what I just described? How to analyze a behavior of concern, set a target, identify contextual factors that we might intervene with, start creating an intervention plan based on that, and that they're not just kind of making it up as they go. Also, how systematic and evidence-based is that process? So do you have like a standard behavior intervention plan form that you use for students at tier 2, tier 3? Do you have a standard problem-solving protocol that adults will go through? If you don't, those again are places where if somebody moves away, is that whole process going to change because we don't have a protocol and a system in place to try and help us use effective strategies? So over time, you want to consider ways to build this expertise with as many staff as possible. I was just working in a district where they are very, very concerned because previously they've had deans, counselors, and some other interventionists in their buildings. And because of budget cuts, those folks are getting taken away, right? So now their question is, how do we do all of this without those personnel there? One of the things that they thought about is we need to get some of our teachers, some of our classified staff members that we could provide training and support and build up their knowledge and expertise, and we're going to have to create some time for them to be able to do this. But in the absence of those other personnel, we've got to figure out how we're going to build that knowledge and expertise. So some examples. We have some schools that will do this through formalized professional development with safe and civil schools. That's, of course, work that we love partnering with folks on, even things like designing your behavior intervention plans. You could look at doing internal PD. So if you have some people who have some knowledge and expertise, have them start doing mini PD. Like one session is on starting to understand function of behavior. One session is on how you identify, objectives and targets for your intervention plans, et cetera. You could divide it up across the course of the year. The district that I was just talking about, one of the things that they're thinking is that they're going to get teams of teachers from each school to do a book study in our interventions resource, which is where all of these things that I'm talking about are coming from, but that they'll systematically across the course of the year work through those different sections to try and build the system. You can also look for online resources. So one of my favorite free resources that is out there is www.basicfba.com. This is a series of free web modules, and there's 2 that are for any staff member, classified, certified staff member, really designed for teachers, but basically in 2 hours that you could train your teachers in how to do very basic understanding of functional behavior assessment within their own classroom. And then there's 7 free web modules that are for counselors, social workers, deans, your student support people, or your support coordinator type of folks. Those were wonderful resources developed by several professors. Chris Borgmeyer is one of them, and just absolutely brilliant to make them widely available. I included this reference within your handout, but all of the things that we're talking about today are coming directly from this resource, which is what the one school is doing a book study with, intervention support for students with individual behavior challenges. This is available at ancorapublishing.com if you're interested. All right, with our few minutes left, and then I will send some follow-up thoughts, but I also gave you some material in your handout. When you're building your menu of behavior interventions, there's kind of 2 critical considerations for building out your menu with Tier 2 and Tier 3. And one of the notions that we have to get away from, and I'm really going to encourage you to start developing this mindset with your staff if they've kind of got this other conception, is sometimes people think Tier 2, Tier 3 means outside of the classroom. It's intervention that is done by somebody else, take them out and fix them, send them back when they're fully baked. I love the annual Not My Job photo competition. That's kind of the conception that we have here. But what we have to help people understand is that if the behavior is happening in the classroom, a big part of the component of Tier 2 and Tier 3 behavior intervention is going to happen in the classroom. Yes, sometimes there are collaborative supports. Yes, sometimes there's another person who's helping with intervention, but it is oftentimes going to require the teacher to participate in both the design and the implementation. So in your handout, this is actually a menu that I recently worked with a district on developing. Also has some of what you would see in our materials from the intervention resource, is an example of a menu of interventions that can be used in the classroom or the common area setting. So any of your teachers who have knowledge and expertise, when they are struggling with a behavior, they could go to this menu and try to design it on their own. But it's also, if I, Jessica, am struggling with Timmy in my classroom and I am asking Jody to now problem solve with me, Jody and I could sit down with this menu and go, which of these things do we think are most likely to work, that we could manipulate some variables and that you, Jessica, are willing to try because it's feasible within your classroom setting. Right? So we need to have that menu of in-environment, natural setting types of interventions. The other thing that we're going to need to consider, and I may actually do a second webinar on this given we ran out of time here, but is developing a menu of ready-to-use interventions. And these are things like, the most common one that people talk about is check-in, check-out, daily report card types of intervention. But what we ultimately want to have is a range of different interventions that we could build across time. Given we are running out of time, what I will do is I'll type up a quick little description of each of these and send it out to all of you. But let me talk just really quickly, real quickly here about mentoring intervention, just because I recently had the opportunity to work with some schools in California to develop a staff-based mentoring program. They called it Champions. And what they did is they said, we don't have enough interventionists, but we have people who care. We have adults who care about our kids. So we're going to put out a call to all of our staff members and say, are any of you interested in being a champion for a kid? If you are, we will give you a small stipend. We will provide you training throughout the course of the school year. We'll make sure that you have people who you can meet with to support you in how to do this, but you are going to be a champion for a kid. And what ended up happening when they trained, we had initially in the first group, I think it was 21 teachers, each had teachers. We had some like a custodian, a school resource officer. We had a few counselors, so classified and certified staff members. They went from some students who were like a kid who had 30 plus absences before he was assigned a mentor in the first 2 or 3 months of school to the remainder of the school year, he only had 4 absences. One kid who had major escalating events before being assigned a mentor did not have any escalating events after he had been with his mentor for about a year or about a month. So this intervention is another one that we're going to be doing a targeted webinar on, but it's an example of we've got limited interventionist resources, but we're going to figure out a way to build the skills of some of our staff members to each swoop up and provide love, care, and support for at least one kid. All right. So I told you were going to get out of here in an hour. We're now 1 minute over. So just final little closing thought, and then I'll open it up for some questions. Critical concepts for tier 2 and tier 3. If our system is functioning well, the higher we go in the system, we should be identifying fewer and fewer students, right? So again, if we flipped it over, that we're creating that filtering mechanism. And the reason for that is as we get higher and higher in our intervention system, we're going to recognize these are students who have more complex, intensive needs. So the intensity of our resourcing is kind of inverse, right? The higher we go, tier 2, tier 3, more people involved, more time and resources, more complexity and intensity. Tier 2 and tier 3 should be a seamless continuum, and it's additive, right? So even if we have an intervention that we define starts at tier 2, check in, check out, that could be something that follows the student into tier 3 if it's working well for them, but now we're adding additional supports on top of it. All right, I am going to open it up for questions after I just mention a few quick things. We do still have a few sessions that have space at our national conference. I am doing a 4-day MTSS session. The content that we just talked about will be 2 days of the 4. We also have one of my colleagues, Trisha Berg, who's doing a session that's focused on the design of specific behavior interventions. So how do you design a behavior intervention plan and some of those interventions you put in place. Kim Earthman is doing our and early stage interventions, which is focused on general classroom management, but also early interventions that classroom teachers could use. And then we've got a couple of other sessions. We are planning to make this a monthly series. So our next 2 upcoming webinars that will be coming up are Eliminating Chronic Absenteeism on July 21st. And starting the school year right with an effective classroom management plan on August 1st. So just be watching for emails of those. And we also are going to do a variety of public virtual sessions that are going to be happening in the fall and the winter and spring. So we'll send out more information as we go. Okay, thank you all so much for joining. If you feel like exiting, go ahead. If you have a question, please stay on. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.